Hello everyone, and welcome to Monster Mondays, episode 21. For this episode, we will be covering No End House. And no, I don't mean No You End House, just like literally No End House. It's a haunted house creepypasta of sorts, and next week we'll do Dianetta House, which is about half as long. This one, it said the estimated reading time was like 52 minutes, so considering how slowly I read, probably that's going to be more like an hour and a half. So, get yourself a caffeinated beverage, get yourself a booze, whatever it takes to keep you focused, or just let yourself drift off to sleep to the sound of my voice as I'm reading this, despite the fact that I'm reading about some pretty disturbing stuff. But anyway, that being said, I'll take a cue from my own advice and a little bit of indulgence. Alright. Hashtag not sponsored. I just happen to like this stuff. L'chaim to life. Alright. The challenge is laid out. The offer is enormous. $500 just to stroll through some old house? How hard could it be? Obviously, you could really use the money. So you agree to take the challenge. You stare up at the looming old building, and even before you ask out loud, what's the catch? You know deep down you already know the answer. The catch is that the challenge isn't just to walk through some old house. The challenge is to walk through that house. You swallow hard, feeling in the pit of your stomach that this house is different. Different in ways you probably don't want to know, but you're about to find out. Completing the house. Origin and influences. Where do you get your ideas? Overview. No End House is a creepypasta story about a young man who accepts the challenge to make his way through a supposedly haunted house in the hope of winning $500. The terms of the challenge are that he must make his way through the entire house, progressing gradually through a series of 9 rooms. The twist being that as he moves through successive spaces, they become more and more extreme and terrifying. The rigidly linear structure, that is, the narrator progressing one at a time through the rooms, might seem a limit, but it's actually an excellent plot device for creepypastas. Why? Here's why. No End House Creepypasta Part 1. Let me start by saying that Peter Terry was addicted to heroin. We were friends in college and continued to be after I graduated. Notice that I said I. He dropped out after 2 years of barely cutting it. After I moved out of the dorms into a small apartment, I didn't see Peter. We'd talk online every now and then. AOL Instant Messenger was king in pre-Facebook years. It was a period when he wasn't online for about 5 weeks straight. I wasn't worried. He was a pretty notorious flake and drug addict, so I assumed he just stopped caring. Then one night I saw him log in. Before I could initiate a conversation, he sent me a message. If you hear any music, it's credit to Muji. I'm listening to a playlist of his. And since I have YouTube Red, you won't hear any commercials unlike previous videos. David, man, we need to talk. That was when he told me about No End House. It got that name because no one had ever reached the final exit. The rules were pretty simple and cliche. Reach the last room of the building and you win $500. There were 9 rooms in all. The house was located outside the city, roughly 4 miles from my house. Apparently Peter had tried and failed. He was a heroin and who knows what the fuck addict, so I figured the drugs got the best of him. And he was wigged out at a paper ghost or something. He told me it would be too much for anyone. It was unnatural. I didn't believe him. I told him I would check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 sounded too good to be true. I had to go. I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about the building. Have you ever seen or read something that shouldn't be scary, but a chill crawls up your spine for some reason? I walked toward the building and the feeling of uneasiness only intensified as I opened the front door. My heart slowed and I let out a relieved sigh as I entered. The room was like a regular hotel lobby decorated for Halloween. A sign was posted in place of a worker and it read, "Room 1 this way, 8 more to follow. Reach the end and you win." I chuckled and made my way to the first door. The first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle of Kmart, complete with sheet ghosts and animatronic zombies that gave a static growl when you passed by. At the far end was an exit. It was the only door besides the one I'd entered through. I brushed through the fake spiderwebs and headed for the second room. I was greeted by a fog as I opened the door to room 2. The room definitely upped the ante in terms of technology. Not only was there a fog machine, but a bat hung from the ceiling and flew in a circle. Scary. They seemed to have a Halloween soundtrack that one would find in a 99-cent store on loop somewhere in the room. I didn't see a stereo, but I guess they must have used a PA system. I stepped over a few toy rats that wheeled around and walked through the puffed chest to the next area. I reached for the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I did not want to open that door. The feeling of dread hit me so hard I could barely even think. Logic overtook me after a few terrifying moments, and I shook it off and entered the room. Next room. Room 3 is where things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a standard room. There was a chair in the middle of the wood-paneled floor. A single lamp in the corner did a poor job of lighting the area, casting a few shadows across the floor and walls. That was the problem. Shadows. Plural. Except for the chairs, there were others. I'd barely walked in the door, and I was already terrified. It was at that moment I knew that something wasn't right. I didn't even think as I automatically tried to open the door I came through. It was locked from the other side. That set me off. Was someone locking the doors as I progressed? There was no way. I would have heard them. Was it a mechanical lock that was set automatically? Maybe, but I was too scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair's shadow remained, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk. I used to hallucinate when I was a kid, so I wrote off the shadows as a figment of my imagination. I began to feel better as I made it to the halfway point of the room. I looked down as I took my steps, and that's when I saw it, or didn't see it. My shadow wasn't there. I didn't have time to scream. I ran as fast as I could to the other door and flung myself without thinking into the room beyond. The fourth room was possibly the most disturbing. As I closed the door, all light seemed to be sucked out and back into the previous room. I stood there surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark and never have been, but I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I held my hand in front of my face, and if I didn't know what I was doing, I would never have been able to tell. Darkness doesn't begin to describe it. I couldn't hear anything. It was dead silence. When you're in a soundproof room, you can still hear yourself breathing. You can listen to yourself being alive. I couldn't. I began to stumble forward after a few moments, my rapidly beating heart the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. I wasn't even sure there was one this time. The silence was then broken by a low hum. I felt something behind me. I spun around wildly but could barely even see my nose. I knew it was there, though, regardless of how dark it was. I knew something was there. The hum grew louder, closer. It seemed to surround me, but I knew whatever was causing the noise was in front of me. Inching closer, I took a step back. I never felt that kind of fear. I can't really describe genuine fear. I wasn't even scared I would die. I was scared of what the alternative was. I was afraid of what this thing had in store for me. Then the lights flashed for a second and I saw it. Nothing. I saw nothing, and I know I saw nothing there. The room was again plunged into darkness, and the hum became a wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't hear this God-blessed sound for another minute. I ran backwards away from the noise and fumbled for the door handle. I turned and fell into room 5. Yeah, I kind of censored the, using the Lord's name in vain. I probably mentioned it in Sad Your Days episode, but yeah, I'm not going to try to invoke the wrath of any god, even if I don't believe in it or whatever. Alright, before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I'm not a drug addict. I've had no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis short of the childhood hallucinations I mentioned earlier, and those were only when I was really tired or just waking up. I entered the no-end house with a clear head. After falling in from the previous room, my view of room 5 was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me, it simply surprised me. Trees had grown into the room and towered above my head. The ceiling in this room were taller than the others, which made me think I was in the center of the house. I got up off the floor, dusted myself off, and took a look around. It was definitely the most enormous room of them all. I couldn't even see the door from where I was. Various brushes and trees must have blocked my line of sight with the exit. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were going to get scarier, but this was a paradise compared to the last room. I also assumed whatever was in room 4 stayed back there. I was incredibly wrong. As I made my way deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would listen to if they were in a forest. Chirping bugs and the occasional flap of birds seemed to be my only company in this room. That was the one thing that bothered me the most. I heard the bugs and other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the outside, when I first walked up to it, it looked like a regular house. It was definitely on the bigger side, but this was almost an entire forest in here. The canopy covered my view of the ceiling, but I assumed it was still here, however high it was. I couldn't see any walls either. The only way I knew I was inside was the floor matched the other rooms, the standard dark wood paneling. I kept walking, hoping the next tree I passed would reveal the door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a mosquito fly into my arm. I actually heard a few of those buggers recently, and I've been spraying myself with a DEET. I'm gonna get a bug zapper tomorrow. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt about 10 more lands on my skin in different places. I felt them crawl up and down my arms and legs, and a few made their way across my face. I flailed wildly to get them all off, but they just kept crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream, more of a whimper to be honest. I didn't see a single bug, not one bug was on me, but I could feel them crawl. I heard them fly by my face and sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially ones I couldn't see or touch. But these bugs could touch me. They were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit, so I just crawled, my skin wriggling with the presence of those phantom bugs. After what seemed like hours, I found the door. I grabbed the nearest tree and propped myself up, mindlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from crawling and dealing with whatever it was that was on me. I took a few shaky steps to the door, grabbing each tree on the way for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it, the low hum from before. It was coming from the next room, and it was more profound. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. As I placed my hand on the doorknob, the bugs were gone entirely, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I knew that if I let go, the bugs would return, and there was no way I would make it back to room 4. I just stood there, my hand pressed against the door marked 6, my hand shakily grasping the knob. The hum was so loud I couldn't even hear myself pretend to think. There was nothing I could do but move on. Room 6 was next, and room 6 was hell. I closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut and my ears ringing. The hum was surrounding me. As the door clicked into place, the buzz was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise, and the door I had shut was gone. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to room 3, in the same chair and lamp, but with the correct shadows this time. The only difference was that there was no exit door, and the one I came in was gone. As I said before, I've had no previous issues in terms of mental instability, but at the moment I fell into what I now know was insanity. I didn't scream, I didn't make a sound. At first I scratched softly. The wall was formidable, but I knew the door was there somewhere. I just knew it was. I struck it where the doorknob was. I clawed at the wall frantically with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood. I fell silently to my knees. The only sound in the room was the incessant scratching against the wall. I knew it was there. The door was there. I knew it was just there. I knew if I could just get past this wall. Are you alright? I jumped off the ground and spun in one motion. I leaned against the wall behind me and saw what it was that spoke to me. To this day I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl. She was wearing a soft white dress that went down to her ankles. She had long blonde hair to the middle of her back and white skin and blue eyes. She was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen, and I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. While looking at her, I saw something else. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only more prominent than usual and covered in hair. He was naked from head to toe. But his head was not human, and his toes were hooves. It wasn't the devil, but at the moment it might as well have been. The form had the head of a ram and a snout of a wolf. It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl in front of me. They were the same form. I can't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same spot in that room, but it was like looking at two separate dimensions. When I saw the girl, I saw the form. I saw the girl, I couldn't speak. I could barely even notice. My mind was revolting against what it was attempting to process. I'd been scared before in my life, but I'd never been more scared than when I was trapped in the fourth room. But that was before room 6. I just stood there staring at whatever it was that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped here with it, and it spoke again. "David, you should have listened." I heard the little girl's words when it spoke, but the other form said it through my mind, a voice I won't attempt to describe. There was no different sound. The speaker just kept repeating that sentence over and over in my mind, and I agreed. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness, yet couldn't take my eyes off of what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I'd passed out, but the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side, my eyes wide open, and the form staring down at me. Scurrying across the floor in front of me was one of the battery-powered rats from the second room. The house was toying with me, but for some reason, seeing that rat pulled my mind back from whatever depths it was headed. I looked around the room. I was getting out of there. I was determined to get out of that house and live and never think about this place again. I knew the room was hell, and I wasn't ready to take up a residency. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for any kind of opening. The room wasn't that big, so it didn't take long to soak up the entire layout. The demon still taunted me, the voice growing louder as the form stayed rooted to where it stood. I placed my hand on the floor and lifted myself up to all four, and turned to scan the wall behind me. Then I saw something I couldn't believe. The form was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how I shouldn't have come. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. A large rectangle was scratched into the wood, with a small dent chipped away at its center. Right in front of my eyes, I saw the significant 7 I'd mindlessly etched into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just beyond that wall where room 5 was moments ago. I don't know how I had done it. Maybe it was just my state of mind at the time, but I'd created the door. I knew I had. In my madness, I'd scratched into the wall what I needed most. An exit to the next room. Room 7 was close. I knew the demon was right behind me, but it couldn't touch me for some reason. I closed my eyes and placed both hands on the significant 7 in front of me. I pushed and tried as hard as I could. The demon was now screaming in my ear. It told me I was never leaving. It said to me that this was the end. But I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in room 6 with it. I wasn't. I pushed and screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew I was going to move through the wall eventually. I clenched my eyes shut and screamed, and the demon was gone. I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and was greeted by the room when I had entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't have time to, I turned back to the 7 and jumped back slightly. What I saw was a door. It wasn't the only one I had scratched in, but the regular door with a significant 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob, but I just stood there for some time staring at the door. I couldn't stay in room 6, I couldn't, but if this was only room 6, I couldn't imagine what 7 had in store. I must have stood there for an hour just staring at the 7. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened the door to room 7. I stumbled through the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed, and I realized where I was. I was outside, not outside like room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung, I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees and tried, but I couldn't. I was finally out of that hell. I didn't even care about the prize that was promised. I turned and saw the door that I just went through was the entrance. It I walked to my car and drove home thinking of how nice the shower sounded. As I pulled up to my house, I felt uneasy, the joy of leaving No End House had faded. The dread was slowly building in my stomach. I shook it off as residual from the house and made my way to the front door. I entered and immediately went up to my room. There on the bed was my cat, Baskerville. He was the first living thing I'd seen all night. And I reached to pet him. He hissed and swiped at my hand. I recoiled in shock. He'd never acted like that, I thought. Whatever, he's an old cat. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. After my shower, I went to the kitchen to make something to eat. I descended the stairs and turned into the family room. What I saw would forever be burned in my mind, however. My parents were lying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to their bodies. Their heads were placed on their chests facing me. The most unsettling part was their expressions. They were smiling as though they were happy to see me. I vomited and sobbed there in the family room. I didn't know what had happened. They didn't even live with me at the time. I was a mess. Then I saw it, a door that was never there before. An entry with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood. I was still in the house. I was standing in my family room, but I was in room 7. The faces of my parents smiled wider as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be. But they looked exactly like them. The door marked 8 was across the room, behind the mutilated bodies in front of me. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment I gave up. Smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me to where I stood. I vomited again and nearly collapsed. Then the hum returned. It was louder than ever and filled the house and shook the walls. The buzz compelled me to walk. I began to saunter, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk, and the closer I got to my parents, the closer I came to suicide. The walls were now shaking so hard it seemed as though they were going to crumble, but still the faces smiled at me. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. I was now between the 2 bodies, a few feet away from the door. The dismembered hands crawled their way across the carpet towards me, all while the faces continued to stare. New terror washed over me, and I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't like the voices to match those of my parents. They began to open their mouths and the hands were inches from my feet. In a dash of desperation, I lunged at the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. Room 8. I was done. After what I had just experienced, I knew there wasn't anything else this fucking house could throw at me that I couldn't live through. There was nothing short of the fires of hell that I wasn't ready for. Unfortunately, I underestimated the abilities of No End House. Unfortunately, things got more disturbing, more terrifying, and more unspeakable in Room 8. I still have trouble believing what I saw in Room 8. Again, the room was a carbon copy of Rooms 3 and 6, but sitting in the usually empty chair was a man. After a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted that the man sitting in the chair was me. Not someone who looked like me, it was David Williams. I walked closer and I had to get a better look even though I was sure of it. He looked up at me and I noticed tears in his eyes. Please don't do it. Please don't hurt me. What? I asked. Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you. Yes, you are. He was sobbing now. You're going to hurt me and I don't want you to. He sat in the chair with his legs up and began rocking back and forth. It was actually pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. Listen, who are you? I was only a few feet from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet, standing there talking to myself. I wasn't scared, but I would be soon. Why are you... You're gonna hurt me. You're gonna hurt me. If you want to leave, you're gonna hurt me. Why are you saying this? Just calm down, alright? Let's try and figure this... And then I saw it. The David sitting down was wearing the same clothes as me, except for a small red patch on his shirt embroidered with the number 9. You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. Don't, please. You're going to hurt me. My eyes didn't leave that small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. The first few doors were plain straightforward, but they got a little more ambiguous after a while. 7 were scratched into the wall, but by my own hands. 8 was marked in blood above the bodies of my parents. But 9, this number was on a person, a living person. Worse still, it was on a person that looked exactly like me. David, I had to ask. Yes, you're gonna hurt me, he continued to sob and rock. He answered David, he was me, right down to the voice, but that 9... I paced around for a few moments while he sobbed in his chair. The room had no door, and similarly to room 6, the door I came through was gone. For some reason, I'd assumed that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and the floor of the chair, sticking my head underneath and seeing if anything was below. Unfortunately, there was. Below the chair was a knife. Attached was a tag that read, "To David from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read the tag was something sinister. I wanted to throw up, and the last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under the chair. The other David was still sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning into an attic of unanswerable questions. Who put this here, and how did they get my name? Not to mention the fact that as I knelt on the cold wood floor, I also sat on that chair, sobbing in protest of being hurt by myself. It was all too much to process. The house and management had been playing with me this whole time. My thoughts, for some reason, turned to Peter and whether or not he got this far. If he met a Peter Terry sobbing in this very chair, rocking back and forth, I shook those thoughts out of my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair and immediately the other David went quiet. "David," he said in my voice, "what do you think you're going to do?" I lifted myself from the ground and clenched the knife in my hand. "I'm going to get out of here." David was still sitting in the chair, though he was very calm now. He looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if David was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly he got up from the chair and stood facing me. It was uncanny. His height and even the way he stood matched mine. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand and gripped it tighter. I didn't know what I was planning to do with it, but I had a feeling I was going to need it. "Now," his voice was slightly deeper than my own, "I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you and I'm going to keep you here." I didn't respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I mounted him and looked up, knife poised and ready. He looked up at me, terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. Then the hum returned, low and distant, though I still felt it deep in my body. David looked up at me as I looked down at myself. The hum was getting louder, and I felt something inside me snap. With one motion, I slammed the knife into the patch on his chest and ripped it down. Blackness fell on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I'd experienced up to that point. Room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to what was completely engulfing me. I wasn't even sure if I was falling after a while. I felt weightless, covered in the dark. And a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed, and suicidal. The sight of my parents entered my mind. I knew it wasn't real, but I'd seen it. And the reason I had trouble differentiating between what is real and what isn't. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what seemed like days. The final room, that's precisely what it was, the end. No End House had a lot, and I had reached it. At that moment I gave up. I knew I would be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I'd lost all senses. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't hear anything. The sight was utterly useless here. I searched for a taste in my mouth and found nothing. I felt disembodied and completely lost. I knew where I was, and this was hell. Room 9 was hell. Then it happened. A light. It was one of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt the ground come up from below me, and I was standing. After a moment or two of gathering my thoughts and senses, I slowly walked toward the light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of an unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself back where I started, the lobby of No End House. It was exactly how I left it, still empty, still decorated with childish Halloween decorations. After everything that happened that night, I was still wary of where I was. After a few moments of normalcy, I looked around the place, trying to find anything different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. Inside was a letter, again handwritten. "David Williams, congratulations, you've made it to the end of No End House. Please accept this prize as a token of outstanding achievement. Yours forever, Management." With the letter were $500 bills. $100 bills. I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked up to my car. I laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I pulled into my driveway. I laughed as I opened my front door to the house and laughed as I saw the small 10 etched into the wood. Part 2. It had been 3 weeks since I heard the word from David. In the 6 months since we started dating, we'd only gone 3 days without talking, and he was after a pretty intense fight. There was nothing out of the ordinary when I talked to him last. He just mentioned that he was going to check something out a friend of mine told him about. But then I got a bizarre text the night before. It was from David. But it wasn't from his number. It only had 5 words in it. No end, don't come, David. Something was wrong. After I read that text, I felt nauseous. Well, I think they mean nauseated, but people have misused that word to death, so I'm not going to nitpick it. Like I saw something I shouldn't. I decided to get a hold of Peter, but I had talked to this ass before. He was a deadbeat, but at least he might have some information where David might be. I decided to log into AOL Instant Messenger with David's account. I figured it would be easier to start something with Peter if he didn't know me. When I logged on, he immediately messaged me. David, holy shit, you had me worried. I thought you went to the house. What do you mean? No End House, man. That place I told you about. I could have sworn you were gonna go. No End. This guy knew what was going on. Yeah, I actually couldn't find it. Maybe I'll try again tomorrow. Where was it again? No way. You already had me worried. Fuck that place. I've been there. You don't want to go there. Peter, this is Maggie. Wait, what? Where's David? I don't know. I thought you would know, but apparently not. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh shit. Shit. What, seriously, Peter? You need to tell me what's going on. I think he went to the house. It's outside of town, maybe 4 miles down Terrence Street. Unmarked road, turn right. Shit, man, he's gone. No, I don't think he is. What are you planning on doing? I'm going to get him back. I left the next night around 8. There wasn't a single car to be found the entire trip. As I turned onto the unmarked street, I saw a sign pointing down the road. No End this way. Open 24 hours. My breathing hadn't been steady since I left my house, and seeing that house didn't help. There weren't any other cars around, which made me think it wasn't open. Light from the front stoop illuminated the surrounding area, and the windows showed that the lights were on inside. I parked my car and walked up to the front and made my way in. The front lobby was typical enough, but as I predicted, there wasn't anyone there. All the lights were on, but no one was there. Besides the door I came through, there was only one other. Posted next to it was another sign. Room 1, this way. 8 more, follow. Reach the end and you win. That wasn't what made my stomach sink. That wasn't what stopped my heart. There were more below, scrawled and handwritten in red. You won't save him. I must have stood in the lobby for an hour. I was frozen. I didn't know how to go on. Did I go through the door? Did I call the police? After reading the sign, I decided I may have bitten off more than I could chew. I'm average height for a girl, but pretty thin. I wasn't about to fight off some psycho that was holding David hostage. I decided to call the cops was the best thing to do, so I reached into my pocket and opened my phone to call. No service. The house must be blocking the signal. So I was basically in the middle of nowhere. I walked towards the entrance, figuring I'd find service outside. I reached the knob and twisted, and nothing. It was locked. I shook it more intensely. Nothing. It was locked from the outside. I slammed my hands on the door and called out to anyone that could hear me. I knew it was useless. No one was out here except me. Then I felt a vibration in my pocket. I reached down and looked at my phone. One unread text. At first I was delighted I had service. I was saved. Maybe the text was from David that he was alright. It was from a different number. One I didn't have on my phone. I pressed open and I nearly dropped the phone. You can't save yourself either. My entire body was shaking. I wanted to pass out. I was stuck there. A cell phone with no service. In a room with no exit. My eyes scanned the room and I landed on the door across the room. A gold number 1 was mounted on the front. It looked like a room door in a hotel. The ground felt far away as I walked closer to the door. In a few minutes I was within inches of it, and I placed my head against the wood and listened. All I heard was distant Halloween music, just creepy instrumental music you'd hear at any haunted house. Suddenly I got a little calmer. David was always known for his pranks. He would He would tell me about these elaborate setups he and his friends would make for new players on their soccer team. Somehow a smile found its way onto my face. I opened the door without fear. Entering the first room alleviated my fears even more. The room was completely normal. It was a completely normal attempt at a haunted house, though somewhat lacking. In each corner was a scarecrow, not even the scary ones. They were the kind you used to see in grade school with big smiling faces. Paper ghosts hung from the ceiling, and a fan in the corner added a breeze that made them spin. Next to one of the scarecrows was again the only other door in the room. Printed on the front, similar to the first door, was a large 2. I laughed and left this lame room behind me. When I opened the door to room 2, I couldn't see 3 feet in front of me. It was completely filled with a gray mist that smelled like rubber. I guess it had to have been some fog machine in here, and it must have been pumping the stuff for hours. There were no windows in the last room, so ventilation must have been terrible. I strolled forward and let out a small shriek. I bumped straight into a giant robotic Jason Voorhees. His eyes flashed red and the knife in his hand went up and down in a jerky, stabbing motion. My heart was racing, and if anyone was with me, I would have felt incredibly embarrassed. I covered my mouth and made my way past Robo-Jason. The fog was getting to be a little much. I was beginning to feel lightheaded as I found the door to room 3. I placed my hand on the knob and jerked it back in pain. The knob was extremely hot. I placed my hand on the door itself and felt that it too was warm. I couldn't hear anything from the other side. I put my ear up to the warm wood expecting to hear fire, and heard nothing. I assumed it was just warm, like they were pumping heat into it, like the final room on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride at Disneyland. I took the corner of my dress and wrapped it around my hand, turning the doorknob as fast as I could, and I flung myself into room 3. There was no fire, just darkness, and it was freezing cold. Room 3 wasn't like the other rooms. It wasn't like the other rooms at all. At that moment, I knew something wasn't right. I tried to make out anything in that room, but I couldn't even see my hands grasping for the doorknob. That now wasn't there. I was trapped. I must have been turned around in the darkness, even though I didn't move once I entered. I must have been in all this darkness. At that moment, a light on the ceiling flashed on, a single spotlight pointing directly down, illuminating a small table. There was a flashlight on this small table, even though I couldn't really see where I was going. I moved forward. The light on the ceiling was enough to make my way to the table. As I reached for the flashlight, I noticed a small tag attached to the handle, to Maggie from management. When I finished reading, the light above me turned off and I was again left in the dark. I fumbled with the flashlight for a second before I was able to turn it on. From what seemed like every direction, a low and rumbling hum surrounded me. My heart was pounding and I started to spin in place. Darting the beam of the flashlight all around me, there was nothing in the room, but after a while I noticed something terrifying. It could have been my imagination, but I could see a figure dart away at the last second, wherever the beam of light hit. I began to panic. I started backing away from the small table, unsure which direction I was going. The hum was getting louder, and I started to feel the presence of whatever it was that was dodging the light. My hands shook wildly as I frantically shined the light in whichever direction I could think of. It was always there, just barely escaping back into the darkness every time, but it was getting closer. My eyes started to well up with tears. I thought I would drop the flashlight. I was shaking so badly until I saw it. The light is set directly on a small number 4. It was written on a paper and taped to the wooden door in the corner. I ran as fast as I could with the flashlight pointed directly in front of me. I could feel it behind me. The hum was getting louder, and I thought I felt its breath on my neck. I was sprinting at this point, only a few more feet to go. In one motion, I grabbed the handle, twisted it, and slammed it shut behind me. I was now in the 4th room. I was outside. I wasn't in the house anymore. What awaited me after opening the door to room 4 was what looked like a cave. I looked down to the ground and noticed something strange and disturbing. The land wasn't made of grass or rock or dirt. It was wood paneling. It was on the same floor as the previous rooms. This was room 4. Somehow, I was still in that house. A few torches mounted to the side of the rock surrounding me, and the cave beyond was pitch black. The torches looked like they could have been taken down, so I walked over to the closet and unsheathed it from its mounting piece. My body was covered in sweat. I slowly made my way into the cave. The hum was gone, hopefully for good. No other noise met me inside the cave, but there was a slight breeze. The cave seemed to go on forever, and I was walking for what felt like hours until I saw a faint blue light. I walked toward it cautiously, but at a decent pace. The light was an opening at the end of the tunnel. I started walking a little faster. I always hated cramped spaces like caves and tunnels. In a few moments, the exit was within feet, and before I knew it, I was at the end. And that's precisely where I was, the end. The ground dropped off into a cliff at the cave's exit, and there was no other way to go. I looked back into the dark cave behind me. I knew there weren't any turns. It was a straight tunnel. I turned and looked down over the edge. What I saw made my stomach turn worse than it did before. What I saw was an ocean. Water all around with nothing else in sight. The drop must have been 100 feet, with a small rock formation at the bottom. After a few seconds of studying the rocks, my stomach turned more than I thought possible, and my body broke into a fresh sweat. The stones formed a number. The rocks formed a 5. I stood up and backed away from the edge. I hated heights. I was stopped by a wall and shouldn't have been there. I turned around and was met with a terrifying sight. The cave was gone. I was face to face with a solid stone wall. It's the side of whatever mountain this was. I had to keep telling myself I was still in No End House. I didn't leave. I turned back around and looked over the cliff again. This was pretty messed up before, and it hasn't changed. This isn't an actual mountain, despite how it feels. I was outside for God's sakes, but what it expected me to do now was just too much. I knew what those rocks down there meant. That was the entrance to room 5. No stairs were leading down, no other paths to use. There was no way I could jump off a cliff onto a jagged rock formation a few hundred feet below. My mind was split in two. I knew that I was still inside, but my surroundings screamed in my ear the opposite. I stayed there on the wooden ground. I had lost all concept of time at that point, and after what seemed like weeks, I finally stood up. Slowly, I made my way to the edge of the cliff and looked down. Giant 5 taunted me to jump. I knew I couldn't do it, and it teased me. And then the hum returned, and the low, distant hum seemed to come from behind me, resonating within the mountain. I didn't know what came over me, but something inside me lit up after hearing that sound. I clenched my eyes shut, and I jumped. The wind was rushing up as I fell, and a deep fear washed over me. I was going to die. I was going to smash into those rocks and perish. They were going to tear me apart, and I was going to die. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just fell. Even with the loud wind around me, the hum was now deafening. I just wanted it to be over. I just wanted it to be over. I just wanted to hit the rocks, and I wanted it to be over. And then I stopped. I wasn't falling anymore, but I never hit the rocks. I opened my eyes and looked around. I was standing on the familiar wood paneling of the house. The hum was gone. The silence took its place. I'd made it. I was in room 5. I don't know how it happened, but I was in room 5. The feeling of dread was gone. I was just delighted to be alive. After a few moments to collect myself, I decided to look around at the rest of the room. My happiness left me fast, but this room was empty. The walls matched the floor and the ceiling reached to the walls. The walls had no doors or windows. I was in a sealed box. Then I realized I didn't make it. I wasn't safe. I'd made it out of the 4th room, but only to enter room 5, and there was no leaving it. At that moment, I wondered if David had been in this room. I asked if he had jumped off that 100-foot cliff and ended up stuck in the room, and if David did, that means David got out. He wasn't here. I was alone. He got out, and I would like to. The thought of David escaping this room gave me newfound confidence, and a second wind filled my spirit. I would get out of this room, find David, and bring us the hell out of here. I walked around the perimeter of the wall and felt for any sort of inconsistencies. Nothing. The walls were flawless with barely a scratch on them, let alone some secret exit. I started to knock at random places on the walls. They were solid all over. The overconfidence began to leave me. I was running out of ideas, and that's when she spoke to me. "Maggie, you shouldn't have come here, Maggie." I nearly jumped out of my skin if that was possible. I was still facing the wall, and the voice had come from the middle of the room. The voice was that of the little girl. At least that's what it sounded like. I turned around slowly, and my eyes fell on who spoke to me. I was right, a little blonde girl, no more than 7 years old, with light blue eyes and a long white dress. She smiled at me and spoke again. "But now that you're here, let's play a game." Something was horrifying about that little girl. She wasn't scary like those horror girls are in those Japanese movies. She looked completely normal. If I saw her walking down the street, I would have just walked right on by, but looking into her eyes, I felt complete terror. Jumping off a cliff was scary, but I wouldn't jump off 20 cliffs. But I wouldn't jump off 20 cliffs twice as high if it meant I could take back 1 minute of looking into her soulless eyes. After a moment of staring, I finally spoke. "What game? Who are you?" I mumbled. "If you lose, you die. If I win, he dies." My heart sank somewhere below my feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I knew it was true. "Which will it be?" She smiled. "Neither. I don't know where I found the courage to talk back to this demon child, but I had come too far to just let David die. And if I died, this was all for nothing. No, I chose neither, but then I saw it. The reason the little girl terrified me. She was more than just a small child. Looking at her, I also saw what appeared to be a large man covered in hair, with the head of a ram. It was a horrible sight. I couldn't see one without seeing the other. The large girl stood out in front of me, but I knew her proper form. It was the worst sight I'd ever seen. Too bad, and with that she was gone. I was alone again in an empty and silent room, only this time something was added. A small table where she stood appeared out from nowhere, as though it was there the whole time. There was something on it, but I couldn't tell from where I was. I walked up to the table and looked at a small object. It was a small razor like the one you'd find in an X-Acto knife. I reached out to pick it up, and as I did, a scream left my mouth. When my hand came into view, I saw something that was never there before. It looked as though something was branded into my skin, a single number 6. I looked back to the razor and noticed a tag attached to it. "To Maggie, for management. Thought you might need this." After reading the note, I started sobbing uncontrollably. Tears were rushing down my face harder than they ever have in my life. I'd never cried like that, and I don't think I ever will again. I fell to the ground and sunk my head into the hardwood floor. I was sobbing for hours just lying there on the ground, and then the crying stopped and the depression set in. I don't even know why I was crying. It wasn't about David. It wasn't even about how I was stuck there. There were still no doors in this room. I was still trapped, but that's not why I was sad. I was in the most profound depression possible. Complete and emotionless depression. I felt empty and clawed my way up from the ground and steadied myself against the table. My eyes fell off the razor and I picked it up. I was going to kill myself. I couldn't handle it anymore. I'd had it with this place. David was probably dead and I was trapped in here. It was over. I pressed the razor against my wrist, right above the 6 that had appeared on my skin. The sobbing came back and I just stood there crying with the razor pressed against my wrist. David was dead. I was about to die. Nothing mattered anymore. With one deep cut, I sliced down my own wrist. Immediately after slicing down my wrist, I was no longer in room 5. I didn't die. I knew that for sure. The depression was gone, but I was by no means happy. Tears were still finding their way down my face. The room I was in was similar to the previous one. Again, it had no doors. There weren't any lamps, but I was somehow still able to see everything clearly. The room was completely empty, but before I had time to think about what to do next, it went dark, and the hum from before returned. I covered my ears in protest. It was louder than it ever was. But it was over in a moment, and the lights returned, only this time something was added to the room. And then I screamed. There in the middle of the room, strung up by chains and naked from the waist up, it was David. It looked like he was tortured. Knife wounds littered his chest and arms. "David!" I ran up to him as fast as I could. He was conscious. I saw his chest move up and down, but he wasn't speaking, and that's when I noticed what was etched into his chest. I dropped to my knees as I saw it. The number 7 stared at me, as though it had eyes. I heard David try and speak, and I got to my feet and got as close as I could to him. David, can you hear me? Maggie, what are you doing here?" His voice was slight, but he was talking. I was thankful for that. "David, I'm trying to save you. How do I get you down?" There were large padlocks on the chains holding him in place. I looked around the room for any sort of key, but all I found was a small knife in one of the corners. The metal was way too thick for that knife to even dent it, so I disregarded it as useless. I went back to David, and it looked like he was on the verge of death. Then I felt my pocket vibrate. It startled me something awful. I took the phone out of my pocket. As I suspected, one unread text. I flipped open the phone. "That isn't me." I didn't know what to think. David was right there in front of me, but that text was from the first number that contacted me. It was the first text I received from David that mentioned the No End House. "Maggie," I heard his voice clearly with my ears in my mind. It seemed like his voice was coming from all sides. Maggie, you have to go on. What are you talking about? How? I was face to face with David, or whoever it was that was chained up here. That knife. He made a slight movement of his head toward the corner. Go get it. I ran as I was immediately back with the knife. Clenched in hand within a few seconds. I had no idea what was going on, but I needed to save him, and I would do anything. Now stab me in the chest. What? I was shocked. David hung there, staring directly into my eyes. You have to run that knife through the 7 on my chest. It's the only way to save us both. No, I stumbled backwards. No, you're not making any sense. Maggie, he was screaming now. His eyes looked frantic. The side of his mouth curled into a twisted grin. Maggie, stab me now. It's the only way. I looked at the knife, and my head felt as though it was being struck with a bat. I was at a complete loss. I clenched my eyes shut, and I felt the knife in my hand. Maggie! And with a scream and a thrust, I stabbed the knife into David's chest. I don't know what came over me. I just knew it was the only way. I opened my eyes, and I saw his face. It was terrified. Tears slid down his cheeks, and David looked at me in the eyes. Why did you do that? He couldn't fool me. I knew that it wasn't David. It couldn't have ever been, or else I wouldn't have been able to stab him. I know it wasn't. I know it wasn't. His eyes rolled back as life left him. But that's when it changed. The 7 on his body was gone. Blood dripped down to the ground into a pool below me. The crimson liquid stretched out in every direction. The circle nearly filled the room, and I began to sink. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It was like quicksand. The blood was up to my knees now. As much as I wanted to struggle, I just sank deeper. Up to my chest now, I clawed and scratched at the wood around me. The lifeless body of David hung above, his head facing me, smiling. The blood reached my neck, and I was beyond terrified. Before long, I was fully submerged and fell into darkness. When I woke up, I was outside the house. I could feel the cold earth below me. I rolled onto my back, and I looked up at the night sky. The no-end house towered above me, complete with my car parked in the same spot. I wasn't sure whether I should laugh or cry. I was out. I was out. I was out. I was out. I got up and dusted off my pants. My body was shaking as I walked to my car, but a feeling of uneasiness washed over me. There was no way I escaped. That house wouldn't just let me go. Something wasn't right. I knew it. I didn't kill David in the 6th room. I know I didn't. But he was nowhere to be found. I reached down to my pocket and took out my phone. No unread messages, but I had service. I flipped it open and began to text David. Where are you? I wrote. Within a second of sending it, got a reply. I pressed it open excitedly. Room 10. Your room 7 run. And the deafening hum returned. I bolted. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't outside. I was still in the house. The hum rattled everything around me. It shook the trees and the air itself. I just needed to find an 8. I needed to find the next room. That was my only chance. I needed to find room 8. The first few rooms were prominent, but it became less and less clear where the rooms started and ended as I progressed. I had no idea what I was looking for, anything that had a number on it. I needed to find an 8. I needed to find an 8. I needed to see, on red text, your address. What the hell did he mean, my address? I slid the phone back in my pocket. The hum was growing louder and louder, and that's when it hit me. My address, my address, my address. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. 4896 Forest Lane, Unit 8. I slammed into my car and flung the door open. The hum shook the metal of the car and seemed to follow me inside. I floored it and made my way back down the dirt road toward my apartment. None of this was making sense. How was room 8 in my apartment? Should I have even trusted that text? It was from David. I know it was him. There was no reason not to trust it. It took no time to drive to my complex, and honestly, I didn't even remember moving. It was like when you zone out for a minute and wake up further down the road. I didn't even bother locking it as I ran up the front gate. My hands fumbled with the keys. I unlocked the bolt, and I made my way to the first hallway on the left. My complex was massive, but my apartment was one of the first ones on the left. I ran as fast as I could. Past 4, past 5. My head was spinning, and the night was weighing on me like a lead vest. Past 6, and the farther I made it down the hallway, the farther away the hum seemed to be. As I passed Unit 7, I could barely hear it anymore. And when I stopped in front of my team, I was in complete silence. I just stood there standing in front of my apartment. The small gold 8 was there at eye level with me. I reached for the doorknob and slowly slid my key in. Twisted it and the door swung open. I was sucked in like a vacuum, the door slamming behind me. roommate. I got up off the floor and looked around. It was identical to my apartment. If I didn't know any better, I would have assumed I was home and this was a bad dream. My mind went to David and wondered what roommate was to him, and what the house showed him. I walked around and studied the area. Literally everything was how I left it, right down to the half-eaten Chinese left out next to the sink. I looked over at my computer desk in the family room. The monitor was still on, and the AOL Instant Messenger was still up and running. I walked over and sat in front of it, scrolling through my conversation with Peter. It was there, word for word. The house knew all of this, and how I had no idea. To be honest, I had tried my hardest not to think about it. The answer, no doubt, something I was better off not knowing. I tried to click out of AIM, but it wouldn't let me. The computer just froze. I clicked shutdown, nothing. Control-Alt-Delete, nothing. I pressed the monitor's power button, nothing, and then a pop-up appeared on the screen. It was a video chat. I looked at a list of people, and there were two names, Maggie and Management. The video feed was live, and all it showed was a gray wall, and then a message from Management popped up in the text box. Hope everything is how you left it. Who are you? I responded. Enjoy the show, and that's when the camera turned. The camera focused on a young man strapped to a surgical table. He was completely naked and sobbing quietly to himself. The image wasn't that clear, but I thought I'd recognize the man laying there. He was tall, with short brown hair and a reasonably pale complexion. This is what happens when people attempt to cheat. That's when I realized who it was. Strapped to the surgical table was Peter Terry, and he wasn't alone. I don't want to describe what I watched at that moment. The screams, the sounds Peter made were unlike anything I'd heard out of a human. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but I think it was the power of the room. I couldn't look away. Peter let out one final soul-curdling scream, but I just didn't hear it through the computer speakers. It was coming from my room. My heart sank as I spun around towards the hallway, and I got up off the chair, and I could still hear the screams emanating as I walked towards its source. I reached the bedroom door, and the cries were now replaced by a hum. That hum had haunted me the entire time. I slowly opened the door and saw what I had seen on my computer inside my room. There was a surgical table with whatever was left of Peter Terry strewn across its top. No one else was there. The others in the room were gone, but a chill went down my spine. The management was here with me. Only one room away. I walked closer to the table. The stench was horrific, and took everything in me to stop vomiting. I knew I was nearing the end. I had to be. I looked around the room. Somewhere in here was the entrance to the next room. I knew it had to be. It was, but it was simpler than I'd expected. Across the room where my bathroom door should have been was a simple wooden door similar to one of the early ones in the house. Something was stapled to the door, something long and bloody. It was the entrails of Peter Terry, and they formed a 9 on the door. I felt bad for Peter, but I'd gone through hell that night. I walked past the table and picked up a long surgical knife. I didn't give the body a second glance. The final door was there, and I walked up to it. The night was about to end, and I was coming out of that room with David, and I was going to stop whoever it was that was keeping him there. The door opened quickly, and as I stepped through, I saw what was waiting for me. It was an empty room. It resembled a waiting room from a doctor's office. A few chairs were lining the wall, and crumpled up old magazines in the basket in the corner. Across the room on the opposite side from where I came in, there stood a single door. My heart sank when I read the label printed on the wood. It wasn't a number, it was a single word. Management. I clenched the surgical knife in my hand. Alright, I'm fucking ending this. They were on the other side of the door. I could feel it, and David was too. The hum was louder than it had ever been. I could feel it inside me. It was coming from inside me. As I walked, it got louder, and as I placed a hand on the door, the room was filled with sound. I turned the knob and opened the door. The room waiting for me was not what I expected. It was the front lobby. The same front entrance that began this entire hell, only this time there was someone behind the desk. My heart jumped out of my chest when I saw who it was. It was Peter Terry. Hello, Maggie. Peter? There was no way. How? What? Who were you expecting? A ghost? Satan? Some creepy blonde girl? He was smiling. I wasn't. What the hell's going on here? Maggie, come on. Just think for 2 seconds. Who first told David about this place? You didn't. Who told you about David's whereabouts here? God damn it, Peter, you were his friend. I'm sorry, Maggie, but that's how we run a business here. Where is he? Where is he? He's in here with us in the house, Maggie. He isn't going anywhere, and neither are you. I don't know what took over me, but I lost it. I jumped over the counter and shoved Peter to the ground. I grabbed him by the hair and slammed his head into the ground. Surgical knife in my other hand pressed firmly against his neck. I wanted to kill him. I had to kill him. He killed David. He wasn't killing me. Maggie, you can't. There's always going to be someone to run the house. No, I slid the knife across his throat and slammed his head further into the ground. I don't think there will be. With his death, the room went dark. I could still feel the surgical knife, but I no longer held onto Peter's hair. I don't know for how long I was in the darkness, but it felt like ages. I stood and I thought I could see the windows across the room. It was still night out. I looked out and saw him. David was walking around outside, seemingly unharmed. I ran to the door and tried to open it. I was so happy, but the door wouldn't budge. I tried my best and the door wouldn't let me out. I looked out the window and saw David as he began to walk down the dirt road. I rested my head against the door and I saw it. My stomach lurched hard. There, pinned to my chest, was a name tag with one word: management. Oh, she got herself trapped there. David stumbled to his car in a daze. The last couple of hours were a complete blur. Haunting images would sporadically cross over his mind, slowly reminding him of the hell that he was now leaving behind. He felt in his pocket for his phone and dialed 911. There was no way he could explain any of this, but for some reason his first reaction was to call. Maybe they could just come here and confirm that it's an ordinary house, nothing more. They could put his mind at ease, and he could go home, live everyday life with... Then he remembered. The dirt under his feet slipped around him as David tore back to the house. Maggie. Maggie was in there. As he ran, he flipped through his phone, looking for the old text David knew he'd sent. There was nothing. There were texts to Maggie and from Maggie, but all of them were blank. David swore under his breath he reached the door. He tried the knob, but it was of no use. With both fists he pounded the door, screaming Maggie's name. Nothing. His fists were red and burning. David slumped to his knees, palms dragging down the door as he went. After a few moments, David felt his eyes sting. He'd left her in there. The woman David loved went in there to save him and took his place. He had to find a way in. There had to be another way in. David rose to his feet with a renewed energy, but before he could move, he felt his phone vibrate. It was a text. Looking at the name gave him relief. It was Peter Terry. Maybe he could help. Hey, Dave, you alright? I haven't heard from you in a while. Peter, Jesus, what are you... I'm in the house. I went in to find you, man. I told you not to go. It's past now, whatever, but Peter, I need to get back in. Do you know how? Go around. There's an oak next to the house with a trapdoor into space. Go through there. It's a service entrance. Why the fuck would this place need a service entrance? Just get to the tree, man. I'm trying to help you. David didn't have time to ask anything more. He took off running down the porch to the other end of the house. Leaping over the side rail and landing in an awkward pile below. He could see the tree wasn't far, or maybe it was. The tree was so big that the depth perception was hard to figure. It was even there before. Yeah, he had other shit on his mind earlier. And who really takes notice of trees? But this one, it was massive. He ran up to the side and there was a small wooden door on the ground below it, just like one of those old cellar doors houses used to have that lead into their basements. David looked around him and behind his back, and he wasn't even sure why he did. He just had one of those feelings. Shaking it off, David yanked on the handle. The rusted hinges groaned in protest, but after a few hard pulls, it gave way and revealed the darkness below. With a heavy sigh, David slowly made his way down. Jesus, it was dark, but soon David was hit with a smell that put the darkness to shame. It was like burnt hair covered in shit and mold. David spat on the ground and he could fucking taste that smell. David got his phone out and turned it to its highest brightness. It wasn't much, but he was at least able to see the surrounding walls. Looking around in the dim light, David noticed something strange. He hadn't been in too many underground tunnels, to be fair, but he assumed the walls would be dirt, mud, or something like that. He couldn't quite see what it was, but it wasn't anything man-made or anything that could pass as dirt. Curiosity got the better of him, and with his phone outstretched, he went up to one of the side walls. He had to get close to see it, and with the phone almost touching the wall, David's eyes grew wide. No. Can't. With his other hand, David prodded at the border. It gave a bit, but was solid. He was reminded of the smell and now knew its origin. It was flesh. The walls of the tunnel were covered in burnt skin. David moved the phone a few inches and followed the light. He saw the areas where different skins were strewn together in some rough metallic string, almost like copper wire. One section made his stomach turn over on itself. It was a face, a human face stretched out and elongated. With his eyes and mouth sewn shut, the nose was removed, and a hole that was left behind was sutured as well. Maybe it was the smell or the sight of this, but David couldn't take it. With a lurch, he turned to the side and vomited on the ground. The tunnel went on for ages. What was most likely only a few minutes felt like hours to David. He had to get inside and save Maggie. Nothing else mattered. Peter was a friend of his, but Maggie was the first to save if it came down to it. Peter could rot in there if need be. Then again, he was the one that told him about this path. David's mental debate ceased after something from behind touched him. With a start, he spun around and was face to face with nothing. Confused, David brought up his phone and reached into the blackness. Nothing except a wall that wasn't there 2 minutes ago. Rank and covered in flesh. David screamed and pounded on the wall in front of him. It gave only slightly. The hall was shrinking, trapping him in as he walked. It hit David like a train. He was in the service tunnel, but he was in the house. It had him. There was no going back. The house was pulling him in, and it was glad to see him. Earlier, this may have fazed David more than it did at the moment. There in that hell of a tunnel, David barely flinched. He had seen what the place was capable of and had witnessed some of the most sanity-testing experiences imaginable. David saw it all, or at least David thought. As he walked, David could now hear the tunnel shrinking in from behind. The grinding, sloshing noise of flesh twisting on itself to seal him in made him feel sick again. But that only sped up his walking. After a moment, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a voice, a girl's, and it wasn't Maggie's. "Why did you come back? Why did you come back?" David stood there frozen. The voice seemed to come from everywhere. "Why did you come back? Why?" The scream was getting closer, and David braced himself against the back wall. Soon he heard the thudding footsteps of someone running towards him. And then he saw her, a girl no older than 13, running up to him, yelling her constant question. David was too stunned to react, short of just standing there. The girl ran up to him and began to pound on his chest with her fists. Hard at first, but then weakening like a spoiled girl hitting the ground when she doesn't get her way. "Why, David? Why did you come back?" The girl slumped to her knees in front of him with one final hit against his leg. David stood there in shock, hands slightly raised and tense. His fear began to ease out of him. She clearly wasn't a threat, and it didn't seem to be a ghost or anything. "Hey," he began. "It's all right. Who are you?" The girl jumped slightly at his words. Slowly she lifted her back to look at David. His heart sank as he saw her face. No eyes, absolutely no eyes. Blackness, and when she spoke, he could see inside her mouth. No tongue and no teeth, just a void. "You came to save us, didn't you?" The girl stood up and brushed her hair out of her face, for some reason even considering how terrifying she should have been to David. There was something oddly normal about the girl. She had shoulder-length brown hair and was skinny as a rail, with a few specks of freckles against her nose and cheeks. Even her clothes could have been found in any store. Black tank top and jeans tucked into black-red boots. She was older than he first thought as well. Closer to 16 if she even had an age. A hum from behind him then startled them both and dragged David back into his current situation. "We have to go," she said, "now." And the girl grabbed his hand and took off. Surprised, David followed and nearly dropped his phone. He tried to hold it up as far as he could to light the way. "No need," the girl raised her free hand in front of her as she spoke. "I got it." She mumbled something under her breath, something that couldn't have been English. And a glowing light pulsated in front of them and followed. It was like a spotlight from above. It was tracking their movements. The hum from behind was growing louder as they approached the first fork in the tunnel. Without hesitation, the girl veered them over to the right. Clearly she knew where she was going, and David wasn't about to argue. After a moment, the humming stopped and stood in front of a ladder leading up into the darkness. "Just up here," and the girl began to climb the ladder before them. David snapped back to reality and he was baffled. "Wait." The girl stopped a bit mid-climb and looked over his shoulder. "Look, I know this is weird." No, I know what weird is. I've seen weird. Who are you?" "I'll explain soon, okay? We just kind of need to get out of here, okay? No one is supposed to be here, and we, well, are, so..." And with that, the girl returned to her climb. David was about to retort, but the hum from behind grew louder. Survival outweighed understanding at that point. And David grabbed the ladder and followed the girl, leaving the tunnel hopefully for the last time. The ladder led the pair into an empty room. It almost looked like a large broom closet. A few scattered buckets and mops were lining the walls. But it was very unassuming for being part of the house. The girl next to him shook herself off and shoved her hand toward David. Her mood swings were clearly something to be impressed with, and David reluctantly took her hand and shook it. You're probably wondering who I am and why I know you. The girl didn't even wait for David to respond. My name is Natalie, and this is sort of my house. What are you talking about? How is this your house? This fucking place is your house? I know, but you have to understand what happened. It wasn't always like this. And what the hell was that thing you did with that light down there? Yes, I know, this is all part of it. It all relates. Just let me explain. Natalie paused and looked at David. He closed his mouth and looked back at her, letting her know she was now free to talk without interruption. This is my house. I know it may seem like hell right now, and you're right, it is. My family kind of deals in some weird stuff. We moved into this house about 10 years ago, and it was nice. A small, quaint place, yeah, considering I'm used to the city, but it was so nice. The problem is my family, we can do things. Witches, I guess. Ellie kind of laughed at the thought. Mostly just parlor tricks, like that light show you saw in the tunnels, but some of us, like my brother, took it a bit too far. He started to mess with some dark dealings. Demons and summoning and the like. I mean, summoning isn't always bad. For instance, I can summon a cat, which is cute, but what my brother dealt with was far worse. We would try and tell him to end it, but the power was kind of getting to him. Peter was never one to listen to reason. Peter? The idea was circling David's head, but he wasn't quite ready to accept it. Peter had been his friend for years, he thought. This one night 7 years ago, my brother took it too far. Summoning demons for a few minutes here and there wasn't enough for him anymore. He needed more. We would ask him why he was so obsessed with all this, and he would only respond by asking why not. What happened over the next few nights, it's kind of hard to talk about. Even with her blackened eyes, David could tell this memory really pained the young girl. All of this hell, was because of her brother, his friend. It seemed to David that this girl was as much a prisoner as he was. Alright, David said, putting his hand on her shoulder, then let's get you out of here. David took a look at his surroundings. His heart jumped slightly as he glanced around. Aside from the hatch in the floor they'd just entered through, there wasn't any other exit, just smooth cement walls. Do you know where we are? He asked the girl, hoping to God she had some idea. Yes, of course, she said, with a bit too much hesitation for David's liking. It's my house, isn't it? And with that, she made her way over to one of the far walls. The surface of the wall was smooth. It was a smooth, brushed gray cement. There was no way through, no door, nothing. Natalie reached into her pocket and took out what looked like a small piece of artist's charcoal. She pressed it on the wall and began to draw a long, swooping line about 3 feet in length. Line after line followed, and David watched in awe as the girl stood back and admired her work. David had never seen anything like it outside of fantasy movies. It was like a yin-yang mixed with a pentagram, mixed with a child's doodle. Natalie placed the charcoal back into her pocket and ran her fingers through her hair. After a moment of silence, she raised her hand and placed her right palm against the symbol, resting 2 fingers against her temple with the other. At first, David thought she was speaking to him, but then she realized that she was chanting in her weird language again. Soon the symbol seemed to be vibrating, and David watched as it began to steadily glow a deep purple. Ellie smiled to herself as she felt the wall shake before it split in two. I've always loved doing that. Credit to Brian Russell from the official blog. More classic creepypastas. And that brings us back to the narrative aspect. Completing the house. Though the challenge and complete the house tropes outlined at the outset that a character must experience at least 9 rooms and might seem to make the story predictable, it also allows the author to incorporate multiple unsettling ideas or images into a single account. Each room has the potential to be different and to contain completely different experience or horror. Therefore, the author is free to essentially write 9 creepypasta ideas into a single post, with the idea that at least one will be haunting enough to be memorable. In the Shirley Jackson-esque twist, the house itself seems to alter its shape, and you have a winning formula that made No End House an incredibly popular creepypasta. Another factor that might have contributed to its popularity is the sparse way in which the story is narrated. Getting through 9 rooms is a lot of content for an account, especially for a creepypasta, which by the very nature of the form and the fact that it should easily be shareable tends to be a shorter story form. Author Brian Russell's prose has been derided as not being comparable to Stephen King or early Lovecraft. Still, in some ways, The direct matter-of-fact nature of the story's narration told in the first person, as if it were a valid account like a police report, with little superfluous description and detail, actually helps the story move along at pace. The directness keeps the reader interested and contributes to the feeling of legitimacy in the account, making it all the scarier because it sounds like a first-hand retelling of an experience. It has also been suggested that the challenge element of No End House, along with the linear stage-by-stage progression and concept of completion, appeals to the audience familiar with the platform and shoot-'em-up challenge games in which the characters progress through levels, often increasing in difficulty. The setting is different, but the concept is familiar and therefore closer to home. Origin and influences. The No End House creepypasta is an example of second-wave stories, several of which were written by clearly identifiable authors and are submitted as a fully formed piece of work. Many other creepypastas have murky origins or are constructed almost collaboratively by different posters in their entirety, by adding or removing elements to the story. Written by Brian Russell, it was initially posted to 4chan at some point in 2010. On June 30th the following year, a creepypasta wikia for the story was created, while a poster named Section posted the creepypasta to Funny Junk on April 4th of 2012. Later that year, a Facebook page dedicated to the story was launched, and it was listed amongst others as a notable creepypasta by Mashable in 2013, and in 2014 the story was read aloud on the Mr. Creepypasta YouTube channel. I remember that. The popularity of No End House led it to be adopted for adaptation in the second series of Sci-Fi's Channel Zero horror series. The first series having been based upon Candle Cove, another famous creepypasta. Where do you get your ideas? Though the content of each room in No End House story may have said to be original, the premise upon which the frame of the narrative is based is not. In fact, it was a debt to several strands of influence. In literature, the haunted house is a long-established trope, which many scholars, recognizing Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, is perhaps the first example with the typical traits associated with the classic haunted house vision, evolving over the next few centuries via such works as Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. Perhaps the work that has the most direct influence on the No End House narrative is Shirley Jackson's classic The Haunting of Hill House. It not only shares many of the same central themes, but the vital detail of the rooms that will shift and change, altering how those inside the house perceive it and making escape far more difficult, if not impossible. Film history is also an influence, where the haunted house has been a staple trope since it first appeared in 1927, silent film The Cat and the Canary, which is thought to have established the on-screen archetype for a typical haunted house. This was a tradition that continued by 1932's The Old Dark Horse. However, in 1959, The House on the Haunted Hill, the central idea key to No End House, finds its first notable on-screen incarnation. In this film, we first see the concept of a reward for remaining in the house, as Vincent Price offers foolish adventurers a cash incentive to stay in the house for the night. This motif of cash or another reward for facing perils of a haunted house gave birth to another and perhaps more mainstream of influence upon the No End House narrative, that being the recognized urban legend of the house is too scary to complete. The outline of this urban legend, which has many variations according to the debunking site Snopes, dates back to at least as far as the 1980s, is quite simple. A house exists that nobody has been able to either endure an entire night in or make it all the way through. Usually these houses have a set number of floors or rooms. The entrants pay a deposit and are given back portions of their money if they make it all the way through, or even a set amount per room that they can endure. In an odd case of an urban legend evolving into reality, there are currently several attractions across the United States and other countries built around the very concept central to No End House, including several that claim nobody's ever completed them, and one that requires visitors to sign a 40-page waiver before entering. And that was No End House. Final thoughts? Wow. Yeah, that was definitely long enough to deserve its own episode, and it was pretty well written. If I gotta be honest, for a story as long as that, I'd only maybe found... It was like 34 pages or so of actual work, and in that I only found I should say Grammarly found only like 500 or so errors with it. Contrast that with the Ted the Caver story, which had 941. But that's a story for another time, no pun intended. And with that, this has been... And with that, I pretty much say, hey, other than the fixes I made to the grammar, I don't see really anything that I would have improved about this, and it ends on a nice cliffhanger, which leads you to believe that maybe there might be a sequel someday. Although, and this is only a rumor, I haven't confirmed it, I think the reason it ended that way was probably because it got so popular, someone actually threatened the author or something. That was what I had heard in online forums way back when, or chat sites, but I'm skeptical of the fact, but I don't know. That being the case, this has been Monster Mondays, episode 21, with your host, The Forsaken Scribe, and remember, Mom's not here, kids.